Hello, Internet. This is Danny Echevarria with theproaudiofiles.com. I'm here in this video to talk about a subject that I have heard both experienced producers and beginners struggle with, and that is how to dial compressor attack and release times. It can be a kind of a hard thing to get on top of, but I'm here to tell you that there's actually really only a few crucial aspects of this that you need to get your head around to master it. And I'm going to give you 4 tips and maybe a couple micro tips that are going to help you get there. So let's just jump right in. We're going to be working with a new track by my good friend and frequent collaborator, Zach Jones. He just put out a new singles comp. It's called Be Nice, at least as of the filming of this video, he just put it out. Let's take a listen to what we're working with here today.
Not gonna worry about it, I can't when things are out of my control.
Okay. So my first tip for you is that anytime that you're dealing with audio material where transients are important or where you're going for transparency, so trans and trans, use a compressor with a slow attack time. So what does that even mean, a slow attack time? Isn't that kind of relative? Well, yes. And there are compressors with attack times that range across a long span of values, but I'm going to use as a case study a drum bus compressor, and I have pulled up here a very common drum bus compressor. This is UAD's SSL G series bus compressor. You might have the Waves version or another emulation. There's lots of great emulations out there, even if you're not on UAD's platform, and they all look and function kind of like this one. So it is not a coincidence when we look at the attack options in milliseconds here on this compressor, that 30 milliseconds is the slowest that it goes. This is actually a really common slowest attack value to see for compressors that are intended to be bus compressors especially, and I'm going to show you why that makes sense, especially in the context of something like drums. So for a drum bus compressor, I typically like to dial it so that I'm going to be preserving transients, and let's look at this kick hit here. So if you look at this kick hit, you can kind of see that it's divided when we zoom in into sort of three acts. There's this initial spike, this explosion of energy. There's kind of a plateau, and then there's this sort of taper that follows. So if I take my cursor and I highlight just the part of the wave that is that initial spike, and then I go and look up at the Pro Tools time counter, look at that. It's just about 30 milliseconds, 29. If I get one more wave in there, then we get up to 40. And I see some people say 40 milliseconds is their magic number. I see some people say 50. I like 30, and I think that it's not a coincidence that this SSL bus compressor gives you 30 as the slowest option, and that's also the slowest attack time on the API 2500 bus compressor and lots of others that you might be using out there. So I've got my release time set to 100 milliseconds. We'll talk more about release times later in this video. And I'm just going to dial this in so it's compressing a few dB, and I'm going to make some other tweaks that I commonly like to make with compression of this type. Just take a listen.
Not gonna worry about it, I can't when things are out of my control. Not gonna worry about it, I know that worrying will take its toll, making change.
Okay, so really quickly, in addition to just setting the threshold, I also set the sidechain filter so that the low end sustain of my kick is not going to be triggering this compressor too hard, so that it gets pumping and breathing kind of how I want as I watch the meters. And then I set the mix control down because I generally like to blend compression when I have the option to. Let's just hear a quick A-B. I'm going to take this out and then bring it back.
Not gonna worry about it, I can't when things are out of my control. Not gonna worry about it, I know that worrying will take its toll.
So the whole kit feels a little bit more forward and a little bit more powerful, and I hear some of the more quiet nuances like the hi-hat, but I'm not losing the cut of the kick and the snare and the shells as I listen to this in the mix, because those transients, keeping those out of the way of the compressor by setting the attack time slow like that so that it misses the transient, that's going to help these drums cut through in the mix. And as a way of illustrating this, I'm going to try taking this attack time down real fast. Take a listen to what that sounds like.
Not gonna worry about it, I can't when things things are out of my control, I'm not gonna worry.
So the drums kind of disappear a little bit. That's not surprising because as you look up at the amount of compression that we're seeing, we were getting maybe like 2-3 dB before, and now we're getting up to 8. So I could, turn up my makeup gain to compensate for that.
Not gonna worry about it, I can't when things are out.
But as I listen to that, I still feel like I'm losing the kick in this mix because you need that transient to hear the kick cut through. And on top of that, the transparency that we had before, because remember, we're talking about both preserving transients and transparency. That transparency is just not happening with this setting. So for that reason, I stand by my 30 milliseconds as a magic number. And if you're using a compressor like this one or similar that has these sort of fixed values as a bus compressor, this 30 millisecond, 100 millisecond combination is kind of a foolproof option if you're not sure of what you're doing. Just don't push it too hard. Okay, so let's take a look at an opposite scenario where you actually want a fast attack time, and brings me to my second tip, which is use fast compression attack times whenever you want to add sustain or weight to something. So I'm going to go to a different section of this song. We got this lead guitar part here, and I'm going to throw up my favorite fast attack time compressor, and that is the 1176. This is the Rev A Blue Stripe, another UAD one. And this is another plugin where if you're like, dude, I don't have an Apollo, I'm not on the UAD platform, why are you using these plugins? It doesn't matter because everybody makes some version of this. So go get one. It's worth having. And a lot of DAWs also will offer some emulation sneakily in their stock compressor option. Check it out, especially if you're on Logic. So the thing about the 1176 is that it only has fast attack times. The attack times on an 1176 compressor are measured in microseconds, meaning millionths of a second. That's fast. They range from, at the fastest, a few microseconds to something like 800 microseconds, so a little less than a millisecond at the slowest. So your options are either like basically instantaneous at the fastest or pretty damn fast at the slowest. So I'm going to go for kind of noon on this, but again, it's all pretty fast. And I'm just going to dial this in. I'm going to dial in kind of a lot of compression. I like a heavily compressed lead guitar. And so I'm going to go for like 5 to 7 dB. Let's check it out. So I tried to dial this so that we're not seeing too much difference in the overall volume of this track. Here's a quick A/B. I'm going to pull it out and then put it back in. So as I watch the meter at the left-hand side, maybe I'm getting a little bit of volume increase off this compressor. I'm not being too careful as I dial it right now, but the difference in what I hear of this part in the track is not the same as the increase in the volume that I'm seeing, the volume change that I'm seeing on the meter. And the reason that this sort of compressor works with this kind of sound is that if I zoom in on this guitar waveform now here, this is this bottom track here where my mouse cursor is all big. This is like totally opposite from the drum tracks that we were looking at a second ago. This is very little transient information. The transient is just not crucial to how this guitar sits in the mix. So I'm not worried about squashing the transient with a fast compressor. And in fact, when transients are not important to source material to have it sit right in the mix, it helps the stuff that does need the transient information cut through more to have you take care of the transients on the stuff where it's not so important. Real quick, you might have also noticed me playing with the release time on this, and this is going to sort of segue into my next point, which is that for dialing release times, the concept is sort of more consistent across the board, which is that you want your compressor to sort of pump and breathe with the music. I want to hear that in the source material, and I want to see it on the meters. So if I play this back, watch how this meter shows compression while the guitar is really raging, and then when we hit these like quieter parts of the waveform, the compression is going to dip back down to 0. Check it out. So I don't want this compressor to keep working in the quiet part of this song. I don't need to compress the quiet part of the guitar. The quiet part's already quiet. I want a consistent level so I can bring the whole thing forward. I also don't want the compressor to be still reducing gain so long that it's reducing gain before the next phrase even starts. I want that next phrase to start with sort of like a clean compression slate. So watch what happens if I take the release time way slow. I kind of lose some stuff in that transition when I have the release time this slow. And it's worth noting the attack times are all real fast, but the release times on an 1176 sort of run the gamut. You can go from fast to pretty slow. So I'm going to look at another example here where this really makes a big difference, and that's the bass. On the bass here, let's go back to the chorus. On the bass in this song, I got this Cush silica compressor. I've been using it a lot. You might have seen me use it in other videos. I dig it. And when I have a compressor like this, where I have like complete control over the exact attack and release values, like I can put in a specific number. I don't exactly know how many microseconds I had on the 1176. I like to reference a chart. I'm going to pull it up here, that shows me what different note values are in milliseconds at different BPM. So I know this song is 122, and I'm actually looking at this eighth note triplet for the bass because that's kind of the pace of the bass. So I'm not saying definitely don't use eighth note triplet if there's no triplets in the song. 16th note is a good starting place, and don't necessarily expect that you're going to be able to just plug in the number and have it work right away. You might have to play with it a little bit, but this gives you a good starting place to get a musical result from compression. And watch what's happening on the meter when I play back the bass. I want you to look for that breathing that I'm talking about. This orange needle here is going to show you the gain reduction.
Not gonna worry about it, I can't when things are out of my control.
So I'm seeing this needle dance where it's dipping back down between notes, which is just what I want. If the song is a lot faster, dipping down between notes might not be realistic, and you might need to go more for dipping down between bars or even dipping down between phrases, but you want breath. You gotta breathe. You gotta breathe, and your mix has gotta breathe. Watch what happens if I take this release time slow. I'm gonna make it real slow.
Not gonna worry about it, I can't when things are out of my control.
So again, we're getting that compression that lasts between notes, which means what I'm hearing as a result of that is that we're sort of losing the presence of the bass a little bit. It's getting kind of squashed and buried. So I'm gonna go back and a quick note also on the attack time on this one. This is sort of between where the drums were and where the guitar was. Bass needs a little transient information to work in the mix. Not as much as drums do. 5 milliseconds is sort of medium fast. It's not fast like an 1176 is fast, but it's a lot faster than we had on the drums. So that's working all right for me. And this brings me to sort of a micro tip that I mentioned. There were some micro tips in here. And that is that if you have trouble getting this sort of movement off of your compressor, like in the metering, like I'm talking about, especially when there's a lot of low frequency information happening in the part, like with the bass, use a sidechain filter. It's there to help you. And so in this case, I've got the sidechain filter up to around 100 hertz. Watch what happens when I just take it off and completely.
Not gonna worry about it, I can't when things.
So one, we're getting a lot more compression, which honestly, this is a little bit more than I want. But two, we're losing it again. It's the same thing where the compressor is squashing the beginning of the next note because it's not breathing between notes. What the sidechain filter is doing, for those of you that don't know, is that I'm filtering out up to 100 hertz, not in what we hear from the bass, but in what the compressor is seeing from the bass in order to trigger it. So it's filtering out that super low stuff, which is where there's going to be more sustain, and it's going to cause the compressor to not be able to breathe as easily. So I'm gonna bring it back off, and then I'm gonna dial it back in, and you can hear how it changes the way the bass sits in the mix, especially.
Not gonna worry about it, I can't. When things are out of my control, I'm not gonna worry about it, I know that worrying will take.
So not only do I see the 2 or 3 dB of gain reduction that I was looking for off this compressor, which is good, but also I'm hearing the bass claim its place a little better, not getting crushed by this compressor. So this brings me to my fourth and final tip, which is sort of conceptual more than technical, which is that however you're dialing your compressor, set your attack and release settings based on what you're trying to get the compressor to do. There's lots of legit reasons to be using a compressor. Do you want to sculpt transients? Do you want to tame transients? Are you trying to control the overall dynamic range? Are you trying to introduce some saturation with like a vibey vintage compressor emulation or the real thing? All those are real reasons to use compressors, but they require different settings. If you're just going into this like, well, I heard you're supposed to compress the bass a lot, so I'm just going to dial this baby up, you might be getting yourself into trouble. You might be subtly hurting your mix, or you might be not subtly hurting your mix. So always understand what you're trying to get out of your effects, and then chart the best course there. And hopefully the other 3 tips that I gave you before this give you a sense of what sort of factors to weigh when you're considering how to dial in your compression. Okay, that is it. Once again, I am Danny Echevarria with theproaudiofiles.com. You can find me at dandestiny.com. If you have any other tips on dialing compression settings, please let me know in the comments. Let's keep this party going. Let's talk about it. Until next time, happy mixing, everybody. Peace.